Ancient Egypt was absolutely insane, and in this video we will be exploring some of the wildest, most fascinating lost mysteries, rulers of ancient Egypt, some of the many religious beliefs, gods, rites and rituals, archaeological sites and finds, all the way to the highest rulers in the height of the power of ancient Egypt, and of course much more. So as always, grab a drink. My choice today is milk and honey, and join me as we explore the ultimate ancient Egyptian iceberg. Tier 1, Deities. So with this one in particular, I could make, as with many of them, make multiple videos on all of these Egyptian gods. There are so many within the entire pantheon, or the collection of Egyptian gods. There's main ones, there's upper and lower Egypt gods, there's local ones, there's popular ones, there's ones from the early days of Egypt, even before it was Egypt, there's one from the middle and later stages of Egypt. And almost all of these gods have their own origin stories, their own backstories, and often they have various backstories. So for instance, you might see one god portrayed as like the son of another god, and then in another telling of the story, you might see him as a brother or as someone completely unrelated. So yeah, loads of gods and loads of different ways to tell their stories. And since Egypt had a pantheon of gods and not just one god, they were similar in ways to, say, the Romans or the Greeks, where often one god would represent a single thing. And I mean, often they would represent many things, but for instance, you had the god of the sun, the god of the moon, the god of life itself, and the underworld and fertility, etc. And as I said, the origins and personalities, etc. of a bunch of these gods did change over time, but we will go over just one of the main origin stories for some of the main Egyptian gods. So in this one telling of the origin stories, you had Nun, or the primordial god of just existence, basically. And he is represented by a vast empty water, or just like this void, full of potential, but essentially no substance. And then from this water came Ra, the god of the sun, as well as Atum, the god of the gods. And Atum then created Shu and Temut, which were the gods of the air and rain. And he did this by shooting his seed. Don't ask. He shot his seed into the void, and then this created Shu and Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut then gave birth to Geb and Nut, who are the gods of the earth and the sky, and then this is where it gets a little bit weird, as if it wasn't weird already. But they give birth to Isis and Nephthys, who were two sisters, and Osiris and Set, who were two brothers. And these four kids paired off with one another, with Osiris essentially wedding Isis and Set wedding Nephthys. Then, I guess because one sister wasn't enough for Osiris, he decides to get with Nephthys too, and after this, Nephthys then gives birth to Anubis. And Set then gets jealous because, obviously he ends up killing Osiris, and the two sisters then go and find Osiris's body, and with the power of love and, a little bit of magic, Anubis performs the first ever mummification ritual on Osiris, and through this, he is then brought back to life. And while Osiris is alive for just a second, he uses that time very wisely to, get jiggy with Isis, and then Isis then gives birth to their son, Horus. Now, Osiris then dies again, essentially, and so becomes the god of the underworld, or the god of the dead. And Horus, his son, is kind of like the god of the kings, the god of the pharaohs, with the idea being that Horus is who the pharaohs and kings should look up to, in life. So they should be like Horus in life and Osiris in death. Then Set grows jealous of his nephew, and so naturally the obvious thing to do, I'm sure you're all thinking it, it's what any sane person would do in Set's, boots, but he decided to go to his nephew and to try and impregnate him. I'm sure that's what you were all thinking. So he tries to impregnate Horus. Horus, catches Set's seed like mid-air before it can impregnate him, and he throws Set's seed into the river Nile. And this partly explains, lore-wise, why the Nile is so fertile, why it brings so much life to, the areas around it, allowing animals to flourish and crops, etc. And in some versions of this story, Set rips out an eye of Horus, and Horus removes one of Set's testicles. And then, because Set tried to impregnate Horus, Horus decides to, spin that around, turn that around, and so he deposits his seed into a lettuce leaf, and he feeds this to Set. He basically tricks him into eating it, and Set does eat this, which then causes Set to become pregnant and to lose his powers, thereby essentially defeating Set. Set then gives birth to Thoth, who we've actually covered in the Ancient Artifacts Iceberg, being the Book of Thoth, who was typically seen as the god of wisdom, the god of knowledge, the god of writing and magic, etc. And within this main story, there are a few analogies of basically opposites represented by the various gods. Like, you have obviously the opposites of void versus creation, you have the sun versus the darkness, or the sun versus the moon, you have life versus death. And although this little story of Set trying to impregnate Horus might seem a little weird, it will make a little more sense when we explore one or two more entries further down. Was Egypt the strongest empire on Earth? Short answer is probably not, and yeah, I guess that needs a little explaining, but you basically had a few different periods of ancient Egypt, and as like every other empire, sometimes it's weak, sometimes it's strong, and when it was weak, it wasn't even really one of the strongest groups or tribes or, empires or countries in its immediate area. But at one point between around 1500 to 1100 BC, otherwise known as the Golden Age of ancient Egypt, or the New Kingdom period, because ancient Egypt is basically divided typically up into 3 periods, or 3 kingdoms, the Old, the Middle, and the New. But even in this Golden Age, when Egypt was at its absolute strongest, they covered this area sort of here. They kept expanding and growing their borders, becoming stronger and more dominant, etc. But even when it was at its strongest, there were still many other very powerful empires and nations in the world. Like, for example, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, then the Indus Valley civilization, the Shang dynasty in China. And so yeah, while they were very powerful at their peak, the Egyptians never really controlled a huge amount of land like, say, the British or the Romans did, and they weren't even ever really the strongest empire or country or group on Earth at any single point in time. Although, that being said, they did dominate obviously Egypt and the area around the Nile and the Red Sea and even up into the Levant. They did dominate these areas, on and off over the years. The Library of Alexandria was just absolutely magnificent. So Alexandria was a city created and named after Alexandria the Great, and this is when he invaded and took over Egypt, and within this city there then came to be this library, which was honestly likely the greatest library in the world. It stored an estimated 200 to 400,000 scrolls from, all over Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and around 100,000 books, which is just absolutely insane. It was said to have employed at least 100 scholars at the library during its peak, and it contained works from all sorts of famed writers and learned people, many of whom aren't really that well known these days, so I won't bore you with the names because, nobody would recognize them. But basically, Alexandria at the time was seen as a hub or, the center of information for anyone who wanted to learn anything. The library was immense. It was vast. If you were a scholar, it had basically limitless information. We're a bit spoiled by the internet these days, but back then this was like the best thing ever if you wanted to learn things. But by around 100 to 200 BC, the library had been in decline. A bunch of the intellectuals and scholars were kicked out, they were purged, the members declined in number, the funding for the library declined, and also Julius Caesar, accidentally set it on fire, but we won't mention that part. And in the end, this magnificent library, this center for pure, immeasurable knowledge and wisdom, and also history, was lost to time, along with many of the books and scrolls that were kept within it. So Ramses the Great, or Ramses II, was one of the many, many pharaohs that ruled Egypt. And he ruled from around 1279 to 1213 BC, I should add. So round about kind of 2,300 years ago, and he was known for a few things. One, for having the second longest rule of any pharaoh ever, totaling 66 years, which honestly, for back then, is pretty impressive. He ended up dying at the ripe old age of 90, which most people these days don't even live to 90, let alone like 3,000 years ago. He also fought a ton of battles, he expanded the size of Egypt, he fought with the Hittites, and after this massive war, this massive fight with the Hittites, the two nations signed what is known as the Eternal Treaty, or the Silver Treaty, which is actually the earliest, oldest surviving peace treaty that we have ever found anywhere on Earth. It was basically like, look, this fight was kind of a draw. We're not doing each other any good by fighting. Let's just agree not to fight, and let's agree to defend each other in case any of the other great empires attack us, and so both of us can prosper without us having to, stab each other every few years. He also had over 200 wives and mistresses. He had over 100 kids, and he was also known for using a ton of his vast wealth and resources from Egypt at the time to build temples and statues and monuments and tombs, all either honoring the gods or honoring himself, or some combination of the two. So a very great man, a powerful man, but there is also a bunch of evidence showing that he likely lied or embellished a bit of his, military achievements, his fights. He did as well destroy other monuments made by older pharaohs. He destroyed carvings and writings and evidence of some of these older pharaohs as well. And so yeah, he was a bit of a mixed bag, but he was still named Ramses the Great for a reason. The Cairo Toe was the earliest functional prosthetic body part that we have ever found. And it was found in, not Cairo like the name might suggest, but it was actually found around Luxor down here, and it was found attached to the foot of a female mummy in the year 2000. The estimates are that it was crafted sometime probably around 1000 BC, so just over 3,000 years ago, and it was made from wood and leather. And I mean, honestly, it does look pretty cool. Like, it's been perfectly preserved, just being made out of wood and leather compared to the mummy's other toes, and it is now housed in the Cairo Egyptian Museum, which is a museum in Cairo in, Egypt. Moving on, how the pyramids originally looked. So just a little history about the pyramids themselves, but they were built by various kings, various pharaohs, mostly in the Old Kingdom. And I mentioned earlier how the history of Egypt is typically divided into these three kingdoms. So you have the Old Kingdom from around 27 to 2200 BC, and then a little gap in between, the Middle Kingdom from 2100 to 1800 BC, and then the New Kingdom, or what's known as the Golden Age of Egypt, from around 1600 to 1100 BC. And while the New Kingdom is often seen as the best time in Egypt, it was the Golden Age, it was when they were most powerful, both in terms of economy and military strength. The majority of the pyramids, including the great ones, the largest ones, they were all built in the time of the Old Kingdom, and everything built after that was kind of minor in comparison. The later pyramids that were built were typically smaller. A bunch of them have since fallen into disrepair because they were built with, lower standards, while the Great Pyramids to this day still stand tall. But what you see of the pyramids now wasn't how they were originally built, because there was, which is missing today due to looters and environmental damage, etc., but there was this outer layer of highly polished, shiny limestone slabs that completely covered especially the Great Pyramids, meaning back in the day, they likely looked a lot more like this. So you can imagine you are coming from the desert, or you're coming from somewhere in the Mediterranean or the Levant. Maybe you're doing, some trade with Egypt, and you come into the city and you see these huge. Like, these were multiple dozens stories tall structures. Like, these pyramids were the tallest man-made structure from the time they were built for almost 4,000 years. Like, nobody built anything taller than these pyramids until the Lincoln Cathedral in England was built in the 1300s. And as well as being the tallest structures in the world at the time, due to the highly polished limestone casings, they were absolutely bright, they were gleaming in the sunshine, you know, beacons of the divine sort of thing, and they must have been just absolutely beautiful. But as most of you might know, the Egyptians built these pyramids typically as just really fancy tombs. You know, yes, they were a way of kind of honoring the gods and showing that, you know, we can build this super great thing. But the pyramids themselves, if you know, see a like a scan of the pyramids, you will see that really they are just almost all rock with little tombs inside of them, obviously for the pharaohs who had them commissioned. But before the Egyptians were building pyramids, they were entombed typically in something called mastabas. And what's kind of funny is that a lot of the great structures built in Egypt, you know, you imagine you have a really powerful, popular pharaoh, they end up getting this large pyramid built for them, and then they die, and because they were so well known, you know, everyone in Egypt knew about them, they liked them, and they had these great structures, these great pyramids built for them, they were often treated worse in death than a lot of the less well-known pharaohs or the less popular ones. And that was because if you're a looter, you know, you're going to steal some stuff, it's impossible that you don't recognize, you know, you don't find these great pyramids just because they're so huge. And also because they were so popular, people thought, you know, they must have been buried with a lot of gold, a lot of jewels. And so these large, great pyramids, structures, and pharaohs were often looted quite heavily. And the pharaohs that were, you know, kind of unpopular, not very powerful. They couldn't muster up the wealth or the manpower to build these huge structures. And so they were like, yeah, I'll just be buried in a little tomb, a little small mastaba. But these ones were often forgotten about. They weren't buried actually with that much wealth. The mastabas were smaller structures. They were less effectively built, shall we say. And so over the years, they ended up just collapsing. They were buried underground. They were completely forgotten about. And so their tombs weren't as often disturbed as some of the more popular or powerful pharaohs. It was aliens. Refers to a very common theory, I think, that the aliens built the pyramids. And not just the pyramids, but the Sphinx as well. Also that they were responsible for the rise of the early Egyptian kingdom. You know, they inspired them to come up with various writing technologies. They helped them in terms of learning and medicine, etc. So there's a bunch of things in this theory, but I would say that it's mostly the pyramids. You know, the theory mostly says, how could the ancient Egyptians have built the pyramids? They couldn't, so it must have been aliens helping them. And honestly, in my opinion, the claim is a little unfounded. And I can absolutely see where the idea and theory comes from. You know, firstly, as you all know, I do love fun theories. So just the idea of aliens coming down, inspiring the ancient Egyptians, lore-wise, that is incredible. And also the ancient Egyptians in the Old Kingdom, they built these incredible pyramids, and then the idea is that the aliens then left Earth, and the Egyptians after that, you know, for the next 2,000-3,000 years, they weren't able to build anything as intense or as great or as incredible or as long-lasting as the Egyptians did a few thousand years before them. So I totally get where people are coming from with this theory. But I think there are, if you look into it, a few reasons why they didn't build pyramids, or at least to that scale in the later parts of the Egyptian kingdom. And that was because at the start, the power in Egypt tended to be more centralized. So it tended to be more like a typical king ruling the kingdom sort of structure, you know, almost like a dictator, say, where they were able to just say, yes, this is our plan. We build this huge pyramid. We spend loads of money on it. We honor it to me. And then the people just went and did it. So think of like a medieval king where he has almost complete control and power. Whereas in the later kingdoms in Egypt, the power slowly over time tended to become more decentralized. So think of it like modern government, where you have, you know, various politicians, you have various houses of parliament and Congress, etc. And so you don't get just one guy saying, yeah, we're just going to spend half the country's GDP on this massive project. And that is typically thought as one reason why these massive structures and projects weren't as popular or as numerous in the later stages of Egypt. And secondly, I think, in my opinion, a lot of people don't give enough credit to ancient peoples. You know, we think because we have more knowledge nowadays and we're more intellectual, we're more philosophical, I would say, and that is all true, but I think in terms of physically building things and being able to, you know, be incredible at your craft, it could be argued that the people back then were infinitely, or I wouldn't say infinitely, but they were a lot better at their crafts than we might be in this current age. Like, I often think we, you know, in this time in general, we have schooling until we're, what, like 16? And all throughout this schooling, it's quite diversified. You're doing PE, you're learning about maths and science and English and geography and history. And that's from when you're, you know, what, 3-4 years old, all the way up until you're 16. And then some of us, when we're 18 or 19, we go to universities, we start studying one subject, and then that goes on for a while. A lot of the time it ends up being theoretical work. And even that is not full-time. You know, people typically have part-time jobs when they're in uni. And it's only really after that, you know, when people turn, what, like 20, 21, 22, that they get out into the workforce, out into the field, they get kind of practical with things. You know, with these ancient humans, if your dad was a stonemason, for example, you just became a stonemason. Like, it didn't occur to the society or to you or to your dad or to your family or anything. It didn't occur to them to do anything else. You know, it's not like the dad would ever sit a son down and be like, you know, I'm a stonemason. We've been stonemasons for like the past 1,000 years in this family. But, you know, maybe you want to be a scholar and go and do some learning, perhaps become a painter or something. You know, that did happen sometimes, but most of the time you were just brought up into the family business, and then you brought up your child, they brought up their child, and that's obviously why you have many family names just named after what the family did. Like, for example, Smiths, tailors, millers, bakers, carters, sawyers, shepherds. And so you think if these kids didn't have school, if they weren't taught English and maths and geography and history and all of that, but from the time they were 2 years old, they were with their father, they were chopping stones. You can imagine by the time they get to 16, 17, 18, they would have just been absolute experts in stuff like stonemasonry. Whereas for us, it might take someone until they're 40 or 50 or 60 to get to that level. And that's only by the time they're 18. So you can imagine when you get 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds who have been cutting stones like literally their entire life. I think the level of expertise you had in those days was probably a lot higher than what we would have these days. And so the fact that they were able to chip stones away, often without measuring them, they were able to fit them so tightly together, I think for me that's not too surprising. And we also have information on how they were able to transport a lot of these stones. The Great Pyramids in Giza, for example, were specifically, you know, the area was picked because it was very, very near a quarry. So they were able to chunk off these big stones and then, you know, wheel them or roll them or whatever, only really like a few minutes away as opposed to being a few hours or days away. So that, I guess, massively helped. As well as using water to level out ground, using water to transport a bunch of these blocks, using gravity for plumb lines to get, you know, stuff really straight. Like, there's loads of tools and evidence that we have found about the ancient Egyptians that I think quite convincingly prove that they were able to build these pyramids. And so the price we pay for diversity and freedom of choice and learning and information, etc., in our modern age, the price we pay is the insane proficiency of just a single skill, of a single craft and trade. And so yeah, I think that isn't to say that aliens weren't involved, because as we will see a little bit further down in this iceberg, there are some other theories about aliens visiting Egyptians, which I think are very fun, very, very cool. But when it comes to building the pyramids, I would say the Egyptians could probably have managed it themselves. And if you are enjoying this video, I am trying to reach 100,000 subscribers by the end of this year. So if you would be so kind, if you don't mind, please do hit the like button, subscribe so you don't miss any future releases, and if you feel like supporting the channel a little bit more, if you want to get access to some early releases, then do consider becoming a member. But now, On to the next entry. Kemet was the ancient Egyptian name for, well, ancient Egypt, and it meant in ancient Egyptian black land, referring to the dark, fertile soil left behind by the annual flooding of the Nile, and that was partly responsible for the sheer life that it brought with it whenever it flooded, because this soil was so densely packed with nutrients, with fertility, if you will. It was literally black soil. And obviously, if you've ever seen a bird's eye view, a map view of the Nile, and you see it's just like absolutely barren desert everywhere else, and then the area around the Nile is just super green. Like, you can see kind of why these ancient people would have in a way worshipped the Nile and gave praise to it, gave thanks to it, and why they would name their country after the soil that the Nile brought, because without the Nile they would just be in a desert, and they wouldn't really be able to have a civilization or a country. And in contrast to the fertile black land, there was also the red land, or the Deshret, which was the red, barren desert surrounding the black lands of the Nile. Imhotep. So I won't spend too long on this, it's fairly quick, but Imhotep was, as some people might know, the first recorded engineer that we have proof for in the Egyptian records. And he is best known for designing and architecting the first major pyramid in Egypt, which was this one dedicated to the pharaoh Djoser. And as you can see, pyramids before this one looked, well, a bit like this. We went over this before. They weren't really pyramids at all. They were these mastabas. And the tallest mastaba at the time was around 30 feet tall. And so Imhotep wanted to design and build the tallest mastaba yet. And so he designed this super mastaba, which, as we mentioned, was just really 6 smaller and smaller mastabas stacked on top of one another. And by the time he had finished, this super mastaba was around 200 feet tall, so 7 times the height of the previous taller mastaba. And then the future pharaohs were like, yeah, I kind of like that design, but let's just make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And so yeah, eventually you get the Great Pyramids of Giza, but it did all start with Imhotep. And as well as the size difference in design, Imhotep also designed this pyramid to be built with limestone blocks, as opposed to the mud bricks that were often used for mastabas. And so, as you can imagine, almost all of these mud brick mastabas have since collapsed. They've been destroyed. The mud bricks obviously are not as long lasting as solid stone, whereas a bunch of the pyramids, to this day, still do survive. The bull Apis was incredibly interesting, and it was this bull that was kept in the Temple of Memphis, and it was supposed to represent various gods over the years, and in a lot of cases was kind of like an intermediary between man and the gods. And this was an actual live bull. It wasn't like a bull statue or anything, and it was kept and housed and worshipped, and when one of these bulls would die, it would be replaced by another, meaning that there was always a living bull Api, or Apis, in this temple. The bull would be carefully selected for its strength, for its vitality and health, and for various physical attributes, like for example, it needed to have a black body with a white diamond on its forehead, it needed double hairs on its tail, as well as a few other smaller physical markers, and when one was chosen, it would be kept and would basically replace the older bull Apis whenever it died. And for those who love words and etymology, this bull Apis was typically seen as a herald or a sign or a servant of the creator god Ptah. And as you know, the Egyptians referred to their kingdom as Kemet, or the Black Land, but their capital city Memphis they called, and I'm not too sure how to pronounce this, but they called it Ptah, or the house of the Ka, or soul of Ptah. And Ptah was the creator god. And so other kingdoms and nations and empires started to refer to Memphis as Hiku-Ptah, based loosely on what the Egyptians called this city. And when the ancient Greeks arrived, they took this name from this city, Hiku-Ptah, and they started calling it in Greek, this. I don't speak Greek, but it was basically Aegyptos, with the Patos being similar to the Ptah, and soon this name for Memphis became the name for the entire kingdom. And then Aegyptos became Aegyptus or Aegyptus in Latin, and then eventually became Egypt. And so the current name for Egypt in English as a country comes from, in a roundabout way, the creator god Ptah. The Rosetta Stone is really one of the more fascinating entries, I think, and I almost didn't include it in this iceberg, but it is so interesting that I needed to include it and I needed to ramble about it. But it was this stone or stele or slab that was found in 1799 when Napoleon invaded Egypt. And at the time it wasn't really being, safeguarded or protected or revered or anything like that. To the local people, it wasn't this ancient rare artifact. It was literally just some old slab with some writing on it. And it was being used at the time as building material for a Fort Julian near the town of Rashid or Rosetta, hence it being called the Rosetta Stone. And the French thought that it seemed quite nice, it seemed quite valuable, it had this ancient writing on it, and so they took it, and 2 years later the British then defeated the French, and they then claimed this stone for themselves. And the next year, in 1802, they moved it over to the British Museum in London, where it has remained ever since. And if you are ever in London, you can actually go down to see this Rosetta Stone. Like, it's still there to this day, over 200 years later. And I have actually gone to see it myself, but it is normally incredibly busy surrounding the stone, so you need to kind of push your way through if you want to get up close. But just why this stone slab was so fascinating and wonderful is down to the text written or carved on it. Now, the meaning of the text itself, what it translates into, isn't really that important. It's basically a decree announcing the coronation of a new rule, in this case of King Ptolemy V. So yeah, not very exciting. But what was exciting was the fact that before this stone was found, we had lost the ability to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Like, it was a completely dead language at this point. And this stone, this Rosetta Stone, had this same coronation decree repeated 3 times. Once written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, then underneath it translated into Demotic, which was the common Egyptian language written at the time that the stone was created, which was around 200 BC. And then at the bottom, it was written in ancient Greek. And this was due to, around the time that Egypt was already taken over by Alexander the Great. And so they were under Greek control. And so Greek was spoken quite, regularly in Egypt at the time. And so with all of that, this ended up basically being like a cheat sheet for both Demotic and for ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Because the scholars in the 1800s, they already knew how to speak ancient Greek, and they could speak a little bit of Coptic, like it wasn't a fully solved language. But with that, they were basically able to translate parts of the ancient Greek. They were able to, link them up to the Demotic and to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And with this, they were able to decode both of these languages, something that hadn't been done in almost 2,000 years. And from that, nowadays, we are able to basically speak fluent ancient Egyptian, like we know the meaning of most of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it was almost all unlocked, at least the start of it was unlocked by this single slab that was, as I mentioned at the time, being used as building material for a fort. And just another little fact to stick onto the end of this, one of the guys who first started these translations, he saw some of these hieroglyphs were, circled, they were kind of encased in this line around them, and he thought that these might be special names. So he thought, if you're writing the name of a king or a pharaoh or royalty or something, or even a god, you might encase them in these, it's kind of like underlining a word or something, highlighting it for emphasis. And he was completely right, with the first word being translated from this actually being the name of Cleopatra. So yeah, pretty crazy. Tier 2, the Europeans ate mummies. And this refers to the fact that, yes, the Europeans between the 1100s and the 1600s used to take mummies that were found, they crushed them up into powder, and they actually used to eat them, mixing them into foods and potions and tinctures, etc., because they thought that the life force of the mummies, the purity of their preservation, would somehow transfer into them if they consumed them. And also they thought that it would cure headaches and stomach issues and deadly conditions and injuries. And when this whole craze started, apothecaries all over Europe were stocked with what they called mummy powder, and rich Europeans would even hold so-called unwrapping parties, where they could unwrap acquired Egyptian mummies of their own, and in some cases break off parts of the mummy, have them processed, and then later consume them, with this being the equivalent of, picking your own lobster out of a tank, to get the freshest 2,000-year-old mummies. And yeah, absolutely insane. The Sphinx water erosion hypothesis. So this is a little bit of a complex theory, or I wouldn't say complex, but it's a little unusual, I would say. But I do, as always with these more fringe theories, I do absolutely find them wild, fascinating, and super interesting. But the Sphinx, in typical belief, is thought to have been built around the same time as the early pyramids. So this was in the Old Kingdom around 4,500 years ago. And the most commonly held belief is that this was built by the pharaoh Khafre, or Khafre, and acted as some sort of guardian or watcher over the nearby pyramids. But the water erosion theory says that these lines in the Sphinx, they weren't carved into the Sphinx, but they were from water erosion. So, water flow, rain, etc. falling onto the Sphinx and then flowing down in streams onto the ground. And so as the water flowed, it slowly eroded more and more of the stone, resulting in these erosion channels. And after doing all of the science and the calculations, some people have theorized that the Sphinx was in fact much, much older than the pyramids. And this was for, I think, kind of one reason, or it can be kind of split into two reasons. But one reason was that there was a lot more rain in Egypt, 10, 20,000 years ago. And so the theory says that at the time that the pyramids were built, there wasn't enough rainfall to account for this much erosion on the Sphinx. So this theory generally says that the Sphinx was built in super ancient old Egypt, before it was even Egypt, around 12,000 years ago. And this ancient pre-Egypt, that civilization, they built a few other things, and then perhaps they died out, and they were taken over by the new Egyptians, which would have been our Old Kingdom Egyptians. And this, wiping out of the ancient Egyptians, that is linked in this theory to something called the Younger Dryas impact, which was this meteor that struck Earth. It apparently caused a huge flood, which is why multiple civilizations speak of, worldwide floods. And so in this theory, the meteor hits, the whole of Egypt is flooded, and this completely destroys this civilization, except for a few things, one of which being the Sphinx. So the Sphinx is flooded underwater, and then the water, goes away. So it's buried under sand, and then later the Old Kingdom Egyptians end up stumbling across this land. They find the life-giving properties of the Nile, decide to settle down here, and then eventually they find the Sphinx. And then later on, the lion head of the Sphinx is replaced with a pharaoh's head, whichever pharaoh was ruling at the time that they did this. And that is basically the water erosion theory. Because we're not entirely sure whether the Sphinx originally did have a lion head, or whether it was always built with this smaller, human pharaoh head on it. But as you can see, this comes as part of a much, much larger and deeper theory surrounding a lost, super ancient pre-Egyptian civilization and of a great flood and all of that. And honestly, I just find it incredibly fascinating. And as always with some of these more fringe theories, I would absolutely love to hear what you guys think on this one in the comments down below. Sceptre and Scourge. So these are just two symbols that were often associated with pharaohs, as you can see from the ever-famous Tutankhamun sarcophagus, with the scepter representing, the staff of a shepherd, so the pharaoh leading and guiding his people with wisdom and kindness, etc., and the scourge being basically a whip representing justice, punishment, and the firm hand of law. And yeah, not a super deep entry, but just two symbols which you may see popping up all over the place, especially if you look into a bunch of ancient Egyptian stuff. The Book of the Dead. So to understand the Book of the Dead, we need to briefly explain the Egyptian concept of duat, or of the afterlife. And the idea was basically that you would die and your soul would go on a dangerous journey through the duat, where the soul would face these various trials through 12 different areas, all guarded by horrible, powerful monsters. Various gods and deities, like for instance Anubis, would assist you or assist the souls on this journey. And at the end of this adventure, Anubis would weigh your soul or your heart against an ostrich feather, and the ostrich feather symbolized Mat, which was the goddess of truth and justice. And if your soul was heavier than this feather, you would be devoured by Amit, who was the destroyer of the dead. And if it was lighter, you would go on, to make your way onto essentially what was paradise. And so this was essentially their version of, measuring your soul, judging your character to see whether you're good or bad, and then sending you to their version of either hell or heaven. But the Book of the Dead was basically a collection of texts, around 200 in total, designed to help and empower one's soul during their journey through the afterlife. And these were written around 3,500 years ago. And it's honestly pretty cool. Like, we'll get into one or two of the more questionable and weird spells or entries from the book, a little later on in the video. But the spells and prayers typically worked at protecting the various body parts of the dead, of the soul, protecting the heart to make sure it stayed pure and good, throughout its journey. All to ensure that when it finally reached the weighing, that it was light enough to move on to paradise. The Battle of Megiddo was the first battle ever recorded in any major detail. And it took place around the mid-1400s BC, so that was around 3,500 years ago. And it is all documented in the Hall of Annals in the Temple of Amun-Re, which is in modern-day Luxor. And we know almost everything about this battle, even down to the soldier count on each side, the amount of soldiers killed and captured, the victory, which went to Egypt. And this was all thanks to a military scribe named Tejaneni, who detailed this battle and many others by carving it into the wall in hieroglyphs. Thutmose led a successful attack on the opposing army. They then retreated into Megiddo, and the Egyptians set up a siege of the city, which lasted a full 7 months. And in the end, the enemy army surrendered, and the Egyptians, it was noted, took home 340 prisoners, 2,041 mares, 191 fowls, 6 stallions, 924 chariots, 200 suits of armor, 502 bows, there's a lot of numbers here, 1,929 cattle, 22,500 sheep, which that's a hell of a lot of sheep, and the royal armor, chariot, and tent poles of the king of Megiddo. And so Thutmose III won this battle. He chased out the Canaanites as well as a few other tribes, and with this victory he further expanded the Egyptian Empire. Nubia was basically a land and people south of Egypt, sometimes called Nubia, sometimes called Kush, that in some cases fought with the Egyptians, in other cases ended up trading with them or uniting with them, and in other cases ended up actually invading Egypt and ruling over them, which we will cover in an entry a little bit further down. The pyramids were not built by slaves. So this is just a common misconception, I think, that the pyramids were all built by slaves, being whipped and forced to carve stone and to push these slabs up the little hills or ramps, that's the word for them. Whereas in reality, that was very likely not the case. We have detailed writings, carvings, etc. documenting the various building projects and, precisely how the pharaoh and his underlings arranged and organized the building of these, as well as the people, how they were organized into various teams. And we also have graffiti from some of the workers showing that they were relatively well paid, or at least, sufficiently paid for their labor. And as far as them being slaves, I think a lot of them would likely wanted to have been involved in these projects. And that's probably for a few reasons. One, you get to do, work for your god or for your pharaohs, which were kind of seen as gods. They often worshipped the pharaohs. And so to be a part of one of these great projects, that was likely seen as a good thing. You would also be kind of blessed in the afterlife. And a lot of these pyramids, these giant projects, were likely built on the downtime that was caused with the flooding of the Nile. Because you would typically have like a planting season where, all the crops were planted, and then a harvesting season, and then the Nile would flood, and you wouldn't be able to do any farming whatsoever. And so in these months, it was thought that farmers would typically, go off and do some freelance work, do some manual labor, do some stonemasonry sort of thing. And so to be given extra work that you were actually paid for to be part of this great project for the gods, for the pharaoh, in the time that you would basically have no work to do anyway, I think they probably saw it as a good thing. And they also received fairly decent housing, food, medical services. And so yeah, it definitely wasn't the, extreme viewpoint that some people have of them just being absolutely forced to do this. I think it's been pointed out various times that you couldn't really get slaves to do skilled labor like this. And I mean, was part of it done by slaves? Did they have slaves in Egypt? Absolutely. Did they probably make the slaves do various things like, carrying rocks here to there? It seems very likely. But a lot of the actual building of the pyramids was done by skilled laborers, or skilled laborers. I just can't talk today. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. So while we're here, talking about misconceptions, I think this is sometimes a common misconception that people have, because they see Cleopatra, she was an Egyptian pharaoh, she ruled over Egypt, and so unless you look into the history of it and the details of it, you might assume that she was, Egyptian like every other pharaoh. But Cleopatra wasn't black. She wasn't, as I said, even Egyptian. She was essentially Greek. And that was because she was part of what was called the Ptolemaic dynasty, because after Alexander the Great invaded Egypt, one of his most trusted generals, Ptolemy I Soter, became ruler, declaring himself as pharaoh. And he started the Ptolemaic line of rulers essentially in Egypt. And so for the next 300 years, they ruled Egypt in a fairly clean, straightforward succession. These Greeks pretty much never married Egyptians. They mostly married within their own family, or at least other Greeks or, Macedonians. And Cleopatra was just one in a long line of these Greek rulers. So by blood, she was basically fully Greek. And then, yeah, she went on to marry Julius Caesar. He was killed. She then married Mark Antony. And then after being defeated, she, ended up letting a cobra bite her, because the story goes that the Romans let her, choose her own death, and she decided to go by cobra bite. At least that's one of the theories. And yeah, the rest is history. The War of Upper and Lower Egypt was one of the earliest wars in Egyptian history, and it's basically the start of the United Egypt as a single country. And this took place over 5,100 years ago in around about 3000 BC. And it was fought between Upper Egypt, here in the south, which was south of or lower than Lower Egypt, which was in the north, and which was to the upper of Upper Egypt. And this very odd, confusing naming convention, it comes from the fact that upper and lower don't refer to their points, on the globe, but rather to each nation's position along the Nile. So Upper Egypt was more upstream, even though they were lower than Lower Egypt, who was lower stream or downstream. But these two nations, they often traded, they sometimes fought, and thanks to King Nama, around, as I said, just over 5,000 years ago, these two nations were unified. And this was after a great war, after a massive fight, but King Nama was victorious. And just like the United Kingdom flag, which essentially came about by combining the flags of the nations within it, you know, sorry, Wales, that there's no dragon on it. Honestly, it would look so much better with a dragon. But when Upper and Lower Egypt were combined, the red crown from Lower Egypt was combined with the white crown from Upper Egypt, resulting in this kind of fused crown, which you might often see, for example, in various drawings and carvings. And this is basically where we see Egypt as we know it start to form. And if you'll remember from the Egyptian deities we explored earlier, the story of Set fighting Horus and the two going at it until eventually Horus wins by putting his seed into a piece of lettuce and then impregnating Set. Yeah, that whole story. But that was thought to represent the struggle between Upper and Lower Egypt, with Horus, or Upper Egypt, eventually coming out on top. The 10 Egyptian plagues. So these 10 plagues aren't really mentioned anywhere else in writings or carvings that we have found, except for the Exodus account in the Old Testament. And that's not to say that these didn't necessarily happen. It's just to say that we don't have evidence for them yet outside of the Bible. But the story goes that Moses wanted to leave Egypt and to take with him the Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt. And the Pharaoh wouldn't allow it, so God basically started to bring down these plagues on Egypt. And this eventually forces the Pharaoh's hand. He allows Moses to go free with his people, and those are the 10 plagues. But one interesting theory I saw was that these plagues were basically Yahweh's, or, the Abrahamic God's way of showing that he was more powerful than the Egyptian gods. So for instance, he turned the Nile red and undrinkable and unusable, which is obviously huge because the Egyptians relied on the Nile for basically all of their food and life. And this was saying that I'm more powerful than your god of food. I'm more powerful than life itself. He caused disease to spread amongst the cattle, with the Egyptians having, for example, the bull Apis and various other gods related to livestock. He made frogs, which were a holy animal in Egypt, just swarm the land and cause chaos and damage. So, turning one of their holy symbols and creatures against them. He destroyed their crops with fire and locusts, signaling that the Egyptian god of harvest, who was Renenutet, signaling that he, Yahweh, was more powerful than him. He also caused total darkness for several days, which I think is quite a direct jab at one of their most important gods, being Ra, the sun god. And finally, the firstborn male of each family just randomly died, including the pharaoh's own son, meaning that even the pharaoh himself, who, as I mentioned, was often revered as a god or worshipped in various ways, even he wasn't exempt or powerful enough to stop Yahweh. And so I never really thought about it, directly like this, how the 10 plagues seem to be a direct kind of middle finger to the gods of Egypt, showing that, look, our one god is far more powerful than all of your gods combined. And, what are you going to do about it? But yeah, as I said, this is all according to the Bible, because we don't have any written evidence of this from ancient Egypt. We don't have any accounts outside of the Bible of these plagues, but still it is a very interesting theory and point, and I would love to know what you think on this one down below. Ramesses III Assassination. So this was a conspiracy all the way back in 1155 BC, where Ramesses III had been ruling as pharaoh for around about 30 years, and one of his wives, a woman named T, plotted basically and carried out, with the help of a bunch of other officials and officers, the killing or assassination of Ramesses III. And the plan after this was to put her son, named Pentawir, on the throne and to make him the new pharaoh of Egypt. And this plan, it kind of worked. It kind of half worked. They were successful in the killing of Ramesses III, but soon after this, his other son, Ramesses IV, He started some trials, he started an investigation, he rounded up everyone involved in this conspiracy, and he doled out multiple sets of punishments, including 28 executions. And this, after the death of Ramesses III, this basically slowly led to what's been referred to as the decline of ancient Egypt, or the period of decline, where over the next few hundred years, Egypt got weaker and more unstable and chaotic. It was taken over and invaded by multiple foreign peoples, the Nubians, the Assyrians, the Persians. They lost control of important trade routes, their rule became split between the pharaohs and the priests, and this basically never really got any better, with them then later being invaded by the Macedonians and then by the ancient Romans. And this all started with this single assassination. And I mean, this assassination likely was just a symptom, not really a cause of this decline. You know, it was a symptom of the massive unrest and kind of chaos within Egypt at the time. But still, it's very interesting. The statue's feet. So in ancient Egyptian belief, your soul and vitality and life force, etc., was seen as mainly coming from your heart, you know, on the left side of your body. And so when statues were made of people, they would often have their left foot forward, basically symbolizing their left side or their heart or their soul or vitality being more powerful and perhaps more dominant. So it was basically a way of blessing whoever the statue represented and saying they are strong and healthy and powerful, and this helped them succeed more effectively in the afterlife. And this tradition actually lingered on into some early Greek statues, where you can still observe this very same, you know, style of the left foot being forward. So when you see these, just know that it did originate in ancient Egypt. Rogue obelisks. So this is an obelisk, and this is a rogue obelisk. Very scary. But this entry refers to Egyptian obelisks that can be found not in Egypt, but instead all around the world. And these are often as a result of Egypt being conquered and with the obelisks being taken out of Egypt. Like, for example, there's currently 8 of them in Rome, including the largest ancient Egyptian obelisk named the Lateran obelisk. But not all of these obelisks were taken. A bunch of them were gifted by Egypt to various countries. Like, for example, one in London, which even though, you know, spoiler alert, even though I live in London, I genuinely never knew this, but it's called Cleopatra's Needle, and it sits on the Thames embankment right by the river, and it was gifted to Britain in 1819. And this obelisk was created around about 3,500 years ago, so super old. It was built by Pharaoh Thutmose III, and then around 1500 years later, the Romans moved the obelisk from Heliopolis to Alexandria, and then over time it kind of collapsed. It was buried in the sand, partially forgotten about. And then in the 1800s, the ruler of Egypt decided to gift Britain this obelisk. And it's honestly kind of a funny story. So he says to the British, like, look, I'll give you this obelisk, this 220-ton obelisk, but you have to basically pay for the shipping yourself, you know, shipping not included. He said you have to come over here, you have to arrange everything yourself, pay for, you know, its own transport. And that was in 1819. And Britain was like, you know, thanks, but like, no. Like, they appreciated the gift, but they didn't really want to pay, you know, these huge sums of money it would cost to ship it over to Britain. And I guess not much has changed nowadays. You know, I really like some things I see online, but I'm not willing to pay £5 for shipping. But it wasn't until 1877, so a full 60 years later, that a man named Sir William James Erasmus Wilson, which is one hell of a name, but he decided to fork out the cash to get this obelisk over to London, because he was a bit of like a, you know, like an Egyptian nut. He super liked all of this Egyptian stuff, and so he paid in 1877 around £10,000 to arrange the transport and delivery of it over to London. And that was £10,000 around 150 years ago, which would be the equivalent of around £1.5 million or $2 million US in today's money. So this wasn't cheap whatsoever. So they went over there, they got this obelisk, they put it into this custom-built tube-shaped craft, and they towed it behind a larger ship being the Olga. However, when they were almost home and dry, there was this huge storm, and the captain of the Olga thought that, look, this huge freaking obelisk is just going to sink into the sea, and when it goes down, if we are still attached to it, we will go down with it. So he made the decision to basically cut the line, and the obelisk slowly drifted off to sea and was lost forever. Well, I mean, that was a bit dramatic. It wasn't lost forever, it was lost for a few days, and after a few days, it turned up just floating miraculously in the sea. It hadn't sunk, and they were then able to re-tow it back to England, and finally it was put up on the Victoria Embankment in 1878. But that was just one obelisk, and of the 30 ancient Egyptian obelisks that we know of that still remain intact to this day, only about 5 of them are actually still in Egypt, with the rest being in Rome, in France, London, New York, and Turkey. So it is very cool if you live in any of these places, or if you ever go to visit these places, maybe looking up some of these ancient Egyptian obelisks. The singing colossi of Memnon were these 2 huge, these large statues depicting the pharaoh Amenhotep, crafted from quartzite and built around 3,400 years ago. And after just over 1,000 years, there was an earthquake causing some cracks in one of the statues, and these cracks in the statue caused them to emit this whistling sound that happened every dawn as, the day heated up and the morning dew started to evaporate from the cracks of the statue. So they became known as the whistling colossi of Memnon. And they don't whistle anymore because one of the Roman emperors, Septimius Severus, he basically had these statues repaired in around 200 AD, which after they were repaired, this stopped this whistling phenomenon, but it is still very cool. And they used to be, if you can imagine, these huge colossi statues. They used to basically guard this massive temple, but after the earthquake, the temple ended up being destroyed, it collapsed, it was basically turned into rubble, it was forgotten about, and while these statues were damaged, they were never fully destroyed. Canopus and Heracleion. So these were 2 very important cities that used to be very, very busy, very popular in Egypt, with Heracleion being one of the main port cities, and Canopus being a very beautiful city filled with temples and statues, and they were both buried or sunken underneath the waters on the Egyptian coast. This was due very likely to stuff like earthquakes and rising water levels. And as you can see, this whole area here, this used to be above water, but then everything sank, the waters rose, and it is now, as you can see, obviously underwater. And it wasn't until the 1900s, until divers detected and found these 2 lost cities, that they finally confirmed the actual location of these lost cities. And it's super cool. They found on their dives, they found an enormous amount of statues, temple remains, gold pieces, slabs, steles, jewelry, just everything. And so yeah, it's very, very, very cool, especially the images they took of some of this stuff. Most of the stuff from the city, it should be said, is still down at the bottom of the ocean because they were only able to really, drag up and find some of it. It's mostly all just completely buried underneath the sand. But hopefully one day we will be able to excavate the entire city. But for now, what we have managed to drag, up and out of the water can be found in the Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza. Giraffes in Egypt. So this is a fairly simple entry, and that is the fact that giraffes, which don't currently live in Egypt, at least, in the wild, they did at one point naturally exist in Egypt. They likely went extinct around sort of 4,000 years ago, so around the Middle Kingdom era, and they haven't made their way back since. And this was because Egypt at the time was becoming more and more dry, more and more deserty, less and less savanna-like. And so they made their way more and more south to more savanna-like areas. The helicopter hieroglyphs. So this ties in slightly with the, aliens did it theory, and that is due to these hieroglyphs found in the temple of Seti I, where, as you can see, this one looks very much like a helicopter, which is a bit weird for ancient Egypt because they definitely didn't have helicopters all the way back then. That we know of. It certainly would have made building the pyramids a little bit easier. But yeah, this one hieroglyph kind of looks like a helicopter. And then maybe this one looks kind of like a tank. This one like an aircraft, a spacecraft. And honestly, when you see this, it does look a little suspicious. It looks almost like a fake hieroglyph. But these are completely real, they are completely genuine, and the official explanation is that these are basically overlapping hieroglyphs, with this symbol being Seti I, which was carved originally into the stone, and then afterwards it was filled with plaster, and his son, Ramesses II, which was represented by these two symbols, was carved over the top. And then over time, the plaster, broke away, it disintegrated, leaving behind these two names superimposed over one another, leading to this interesting looking helicopter-looking symbol. That is, if you believe the official narrative. How the Egyptians defeated the Persians is an absolutely wild tale. So, as you can imagine, the strength of Egypt gained and kind of waned over the years, over the millennia, as did, the strength of every other kingdom in the region. And one of the big contenders for the Egyptians around 500 BC were the Persians. They had this absolutely huge empire, but one of the kingdoms that they didn't yet control was Egypt. And so, after some failed attempts at diplomacy, the Persians went to invade Egypt, and one strategy they used while fighting was to place cats and frogs and calves, as well as a few other animals, near their front lines, because they knew that the Egyptians saw these animals, especially cats, as, holy and divine, and so they thought the Egyptians wouldn't attack them. And for the most part, the Egyptians didn't. Cats were held in such high regard by the Egyptians that even killing a cat accidentally in ancient Egypt was actually punishable by death. And so this clever, unusual kind of psychological warfare strategy, it just helped slow down the Egyptian counterattacks. It worked to, drain or bash their morale, and was in part why Persia won. Now, how much this actually affected the outcome is kind of questionable, because the Persians very likely had better fighters, they had better political connections, they had better leadership and military structure, etc. And so they likely would have beaten the Egyptians, in time anyway. But this was just one of the very interesting and clever strategies that they used in their battles with the Egyptians at the time. Nabta Playa. So this is a very cool archaeological entry, and it was kind of like this basin or this lake around here that dates back to around 9,500 to 10,000 years ago. So thousands of years before the pyramids, before even Egypt existed. And back this far in time, this whole area wasn't really a dry desert, like it is now, but it was a somewhat humid, somewhat savanna style land. So they had wild animals natural to the area, trees, grass, plants, everything like that. And even had, for instance, a lake like this lake at Nabta Playa. And obviously since then the lake is now fully dried out and it is currently a desert, but we have a bunch of archaeological sites around this area that we have discovered over the years. And it makes sense that people would regularly come to this lake in these ancient times. In Africa, in these more dry areas, something like a lake, great for washing, amazing for drinking, and for taking water from, for, if you're growing certain crops. But these archaeological sites basically tell a tale of these ancient people who, for instance, built this, the calendar circle, which was used likely to track the stars and the moon. We also see evidence of this really advanced, for the time, these really advanced camps and villages and building structures, etc. There's also evidence of an ancient cow cult, as well as pottery and weapons and jewelry, and these things and these people were very likely the precursors to the ancient Egyptians, since as the land started to get more and more dry, they likely roamed closer and closer east towards the Nile, and then they, eventually would become the Upper and Lower Egyptian people, and then be united into one Egypt. But even with these people, we can track back like some of their interests, some of their culture, stuff that we might associate with the ancient Egyptians. Stuff like a focus on astronomical objects, stars, the sun, the moon, all as key parts of worship, as well as the cow worship, which all did in some ways make their way into the Egyptian culture and religion. The Diary of Merer are the oldest papyri ever found. So this was basically a collection of papyruses which were around 4,500 years old, and they detailed the transport of limestone blocks from Tura to Giza for the construction of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And they were found in 2013 in a cave at Wadi al-Jah, so this area here, and they are basically a logbook documenting Merer, who was a logistics officer, an inspector, a foreman or whatever, and he was in charge of around 40 men. And these 40 men, their task was to basically transport all of this limestone. So within these texts, it describes moving the white limestone first from the quarries, then to the Nile, and then describes the use of the Nile and, special canals to basically move the stone over to the pyramid site. It details, schedules of how many trips back and forth they made, being around 2 or 3 round trips every 10 days, spanning for months in total. And it has further details about the workers' supplies, their food supplies, and a lot of their daily activities. So yeah, an absolutely fascinating piece of, early documented Egyptian account and history of something as great as the building of one of these, Great Pyramids. The Great Void is a notably large space within one of the Great Pyramids found in 2017, and it was found using this cosmic ray muon radiography, which sounds complicated, but it's basically like shooting beams into the pyramid, and it's a bit more sciencey than that. But by doing this, by seeing how everything bounced around, they were able to basically see this giant void within the pyramid. And this large area, the seemingly empty area within the pyramid, they dubbed the Great Void. It is over 30 meters or 100 feet in length. It is seated above the Grand Gallery, or this corridor here leading up to the King's Chamber, and nobody knows to this day what the purpose of this is or was. Was it perhaps a failed attempt at a Grand Gallery? Maybe they made it a bit too high and then they had to lower the Grand Gallery, which is the one that we see today. Or was this perhaps connected to an older King's Chamber that was a bit higher up? Then they ended up just collapsing that and moving everything a little bit lower down. Was it some sort of access tunnel to help with the construction of the King's Chamber or of the Grand Gallery below it? Or was it a, just another room entirely? And nobody has explored this room at all. It is completely closed off, and so we don't know if there's any treasures in there or information carved into the walls, or if it's completely safe, or it's structurally unsound, or even if it might be booby-trapped. And as I said, it's completely inaccessible. There's no corridors leading into it or anything like that. There's no paths, and no one to this day has ever been in there. Well, I'm sure the people building the pyramids were probably in there, but yeah, nobody since that. And there are actually future plans to go in there, and it starts with this really cool plan, this really cool idea, I think, of drilling long holes up into this void, up into this space, and then sending these tiny, tiny robots through the hole. And, they'll be able to light up the area, they'll be able to take photographs for us, and so we'll kind of be able to explore it without actually exploring it. And then I'm sure if there's any treasures in there, if there's any interesting stuff scrawled onto the walls, we will eventually be able to make our way up in there. But it is a very cool kind of mysterious entry nonetheless. Tier 4. Dinosaurs built the pyramids. Oh boy, another very fun entry. And I really just love when you enter these like ridiculous entries into Google, just how seriously the AI response always is. Like, are people really wholeheartedly like believing and Googling this stuff? I mean, you're going to look at this photo and tell me that you still don't believe that pyramids were built by dinosaurs? Like, Honestly, just get real, guys. Just accept the truth. Just see the light. Hashtag dinosaur pharaoh dynasty. Hashtag the truth must come out. Hashtag Pharaohsaurus Rex. Hashtag why am I doing this? The Benben Stone. So in Egyptian mythology, as we briefly at least covered before, the entire universe was a void. A watery void known as Nun. And according to legend, the first solid land to emerge from this watery void was the Benben. And then from this piece of land, more and more land emerged, more gods were created, etc. But this mound, this peak, is represented in various Benben stones around the world. And obviously to the Egyptians, the creation of these Benben stones, often used as the peaks of pyramids or obelisks, they were incredibly important as they represented the very first thing to avoid or to emerge from the void. And what's more, they were often super polished, super shiny and reflective. And if you can imagine the top of the pyramid or obelisk, wherever you put these Benben stones, the top point would be the point that the morning sun hits first. And so just as darkness is waning and sunlight is slowly creeping over the horizon, then the first thing it hits, just bam, the first thing would be this Benben stone. And because it is so highly polished, it would just absolutely shine like a beacon. So it must have been just an absolutely gorgeous sight every single morning. The land of Punt, or Punt, was an ancient land that Egypt knew of. They traded goods with Egypt and supplied various luxury goods, like for example gold, incense, ivory, various rare animals. But to this day, we simply don't know where this land was. The Egyptians referred to it as God's land, and they saw it sort of as a paradise, being able to get these rare metals and gems and animals, but we simply don't know exactly where it was located. It is, to this day, considered a lost civilization, which perhaps we'll do a lost civilization iceberg sometime in the future. I think that honestly sounds incredibly fun. But the most likely theories as to where this land was is that it was located somewhere to the south of Egypt, somewhere around sort of Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, or it was across the narrow Red Sea, maybe somewhere over in the sort of Yemen area. If you have an absolutely fantastical imagination, some people have posited it as being as far as like Middle Africa or as far as Indonesia. But honestly, those seem a little far off from, somewhere that Egypt would regularly back and forth trade with. And for Egypt to mention them so readily, so frequently, or at least semi-frequently, it does seem a little bit far-fetched. But hey, it's a lost civilization, and maybe aliens were involved, so I guess anything is possible. Jewels from outer space. So I covered one of these in my ancient artifacts iceberg, and that was Tutankhamun's dagger, which was a fascinating little piece made from meteoric iron, which is iron from a meteor and not from the ground. And what's wild about this is that a lot of these pieces of jewelry and the dagger, for example, were made from this malleable meteoric iron around 2000 years before iron smelting would actually become a thing. So this was iron from space back when nobody else in the world had iron. People weren't smelting it. They had gone from like the Stone Age straight to the Bronze Age. And so this dagger that Tutankhamun had, if you can imagine, was more rare than gold or gems or anything, because he literally had a space dagger. And the Egyptians knew somehow, maybe they saw a meteor land and then they recognized what a meteor was, when they stumbled across it, when they found iron there. But they seem to know that this metal came from the sky, as they commonly referred to this iron as heavenly metal and treated it as if it came from the gods, from the sky. And yeah, you also have what were called the Gerza beads. So these little tube-like beads made also out of meteoric iron. And you had Tutankhamun's dagger and a scarab that was buried with Tutankhamun that was also made from not meteoric iron, but meteoric glass. And this was formed in the, super, super hot impact of a meteor. So as it's flying down to Earth, it is so hot that the glass, the stuff on the edge. The rock essentially, it superheats, it turns into a form of glass, and they made this scarab out of it. And the meteor that this glass came from landed in the desert an estimated 30 million years ago. So yeah, absolutely wild, some very, very fascinating artifacts. And as I said, if you like artifacts, do check out my Ancient Artifacts Iceberg. I will leave a link to the full playlist down in the description below. Lost capitals. So we mentioned one of these a little bit earlier, that being Heracleion, which was this port city that was lost, forgotten about over time, ended up sinking into the water, underneath the water, and then was rediscovered in the year 2000. And another example of this was Amarna, or Akhetaten, which was a city founded by Akhenaten, which is a very clever naming system. I guess it's not that much worse than Alexander the Great, creating all of these Alexandrias all over the world. But this city was created and then made the capital of Egypt during the reign of Akhenaten. But shortly after his death, almost immediately after, everyone was like, yeah, this was a stupid idea. Can we just move the capital back to where it was? And that is exactly what they did. They moved the capital back, they abandoned Akhetaten, and everyone just basically over time forgot about its existence. And we didn't even know where it was located until the 1900s when it was rediscovered. But so many more of these lost cities are or were just never found. Like for example, Thinis or Tienu. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce these names, but this was the capital of Egypt during the first Egyptian dynasty that is still just completely lost. You also have, they're really testing me with these names. I'm gonna go with Egyptawi, but this was the Egyptian capital for over 400 years in the Middle Kingdom, and it is still mostly lost. Ramesses, which was a great city and capital built by Ramesses the Great, was also abandoned and lost. And it is pretty wild to think, even, with all of the ruins we've uncovered, all of the artifacts and inscriptions we found, all of the writing, etc., that it's still only a fraction of what actually existed. And I sometimes think, like, if you had, X-ray vision of all of the ground, all of the earth, all over the planet, just what knowledge you might be able to find or uncover, what historical secrets are locked behind the ruins of the world, deep underneath somewhere that we might just never think to look. And yeah, it's just a wild thought. el-Qa'ab, or Mother of Pots, refers to this area nearby that is littered with millions of broken pieces of pots, which, just look at it. It is completely wild. But this area, this site, it was one of the earliest cemeteries in all of Egypt, with evidence for kings and queens being buried here from the first and second dynasties and from even the pre-dynastic rulers, so before Egypt even became a proper nation. It was likely founded around 6,000 years ago and continued to be used as a tomb for kings and queens, or pharaohs, until the second dynasty, so around 4,500 years ago. It then stopped being used as a cemetery and likely started being used as some kind of a holy site and a site for cultic practices from around 2000 BC up until around about the times of Jesus and Julius Caesar and, Cleopatra and the turn of the millennium. The Dendera Lightbulb. So this was a set of stone reliefs found in an old temple in Egypt, and they seem to depict, some would say, a light bulb or a light source of some kind. And we're not just talking like, fire being a light source, but this one in particular seems to be electrical. Either this entire thing is the light bulb, or this here is the light bulb, and what, you have as the bubble sort of thing, this could be the light emitting from the bulb, and then this here would be the electrical cable. And yeah, that is again linked to the theory of a super advanced Egypt, perhaps trained or influenced or inspired by something like aliens. Whereas the more mainstream theory about this depiction is that it's simply a lotus flower. So this part here is the flower, this would be the stem of the flower, and it is spawning a snake, which represented the god Har-Somptus. And this right here would be the protective field around the snake. So I mean, as I said, it's definitely a very interesting one. And since it is a fringe theory, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this down in the comments below. Is this a snake in a bubble? Is this, an ancient depiction of a light bulb, of wired electricity? Let me know down below. DB30 or DB320 is one of the coolest tombs, I think, in ancient Egypt, and it contains the mummies, the remains of over 50 kings and queens, princesses and princes from around the 17th dynasty to the 21st dynasty. But importantly, this wasn't a burial site or, necessarily like a cemetery, but it was what is often called a cache, and it was started likely in the 21st dynasty, so around 1000 BC or 3000 years ago, and its purpose was to secure the bodies and the mummies of pharaohs, kings, queens, and other members of royalty who were susceptible to being looted. So during the rule of Ramesses IX, he had people basically go around, check on these old tombs, on these old burial sites, saying like, okay, yeah, this tomb needs repairing, this one needs fixing up, this one's been looted, etc. And this movement culminated in them moving a bunch of these vulnerable mummies over to safety in this cache. So it wasn't big or flashy because it wasn't designed to be. It was actually designed to be exactly this, just boring, hidden, and it was a way basically of protecting these pharaohs from having their bodies desecrated, which would obviously affect them in the afterlife. So the bodies were all collected up, these mummies, they were moved into this burial area, through the entrance, and then the whole area was buried, it was filled with sand and rocks, and the entrance was completely shut off. And this did successfully protect them because it wasn't discovered until almost 3000 years later in the mid-1800s. Tier 5, Alien Black Boxes. So this entry is referring to the Serapeum of Saqqara, which was this massive, wild underground tomb. It was sort of like a vault area. It's pretty cool if I show you some photos of it, but it was built originally likely in the 14th century BC, so around 3,500 years ago. And it was gradually expanded upon. There was new extensions, new corridors, etc. being built, as well as stuff like new vaults and tombs. And honestly, if you see the maps of this place, you can see just how huge the actual place was. And it was located, or still is located, relatively nearby the Great Pyramids, and was used very likely for, among many other things, for burial and for honoring of the bull Apis, which were the holy bulls that we mentioned earlier that have been basically worshipped ever since the early days of Egypt. But over the years, much of the crypt was looted, it was ransacked and damaged, with people basically destroying the mummified bulls, scratching the names of the bulls off these, tombs, and opening the tombs, and just in general, basically desecrating the area. Now, exactly why they did this, we're not exactly sure, but this entry refers not just to the Serapeum or the crypt or the tomb itself, but to these large tombs made from granite, made from basalt and diorite and various other stones. It refers to them, and they, if you look at the size of them, are just absolutely huge. They are around 2 meters or 6.5 feet wide and around 10 to 12 feet long. And back when these were made, they were likely, beautifully crafted, super fine edges, super sharp corners. They must have looked absolutely gorgeous. But there are many theories as to what exactly these were, as to who built them, and as to who they were intended for. So the standard theory is that the ancient Egyptians made these with great effort, and they were sized up because they had to house the bodies of these large bulls, being, the bull Apis when they died. So, okay, that kind of makes sense. But other theories say that these tombs were specially crafted either by or for the Anunnaki, which were these beings thought by some people to be aliens that visited the Egyptians way back when and possibly helped them build the pyramids. And when the Anunnaki left, they emptied the boxes themselves, zooping up the dead bodies of the Anunnaki who died here and taking them with them and leaving these coffins essentially completely empty. And so the Egyptians had these coffins, maybe they forgot about the Anunnaki, maybe something else happened, and so they used them, they repurposed them to, house the bodies of their holy bulls. That is one of the theories. Another theory says that these were used somehow as like a large wireless energy generation center to power and send wireless electricity all over Egypt, which I think that's a little bit speculative. But if you just only take these for what they physically are, they are an absolutely incredible bit of craftsmanship. Just the sheer size and weights of these must have been just insane. And being able to actually transport them down here and fit them into these relatively small crypts was a fantastic feat of engineering. And I can just imagine that these tombs, these crypts, must have just been absolutely beautiful and also terrifying and eerie when they were all built and fully maintained. The Egyptian gods are aliens who came to Earth. So linking up to the aliens helped build the pyramids theory, this theory says that all or most or some of the Egyptian gods and goddesses were inspired or based on aliens who once came down to Earth. So it's kind of an interesting theory. You do get theories like this in some other cultures, like for instance the ancient Irish gods, who people thought they might have been based on aliens that came and visited the ancient Irish, or they might have been based on ancient powerful people from somewhere in Europe that came over to Ireland. There's a very cool rabbit hole to go down on that one. But yeah, this theory kind of draws off stories within the Egyptian myths, like for instance the divine gods coming down from the stars, descending into the world onto Earth to rule as the first pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And then obviously the people came to worship them, they told stories about them, and these powerful beings, the truth of them being aliens was just lost over time, and they were kind of seen as, Thor in Marvel, where they are Thor is technically an alien, but him and his people, they come down to Earth, and then they are seen as gods by the humans and then worshipped as gods, and it's that same sort of parallel. The Egyptian conception of the soul. So, as I always say with a lot of the more complex entries, I could probably make an entire 30-minute video just on this topic alone. At least 30 minutes, maybe even an hour of like this long rambling chat about Egyptian souls. But basically, to sum this up, the Egyptians had a very cool, somewhat complex, I would say, conception of the human soul, and it was made up of various different parts. You had the Ket, or the physical body, the Sa, or the spirit, and this Sa is the part that would journey through the afterlife, the Ren, which was one's name or identity, the Ba, or one's personality, the Ka, or your vital essence, the Ib, or the heart, the Shut, or the shadow, the Sekhem, or your power, and there was the Ak as well, but we will get into that a little bit later on. But these parts of the soul all kind of tell us something about the ancient Egyptians and help us understand and help explain some of their rites, their rituals, and their beliefs. So for example, they believed that while the Sa, or the spirit, was the one who journeyed down into the afterlife, the Ket, or the physical body, still had to remain and exist in order for the spirit to make the journey. And so that is why, in part at least, the bodies were mummified, they were preserved in order to allow the soul as much time as possible for the journey in the afterlife. The same could also be said to an extent about one's Ren, or their name or identity, and so often this was partly why powerful men and women would be glorified after death and have carvings and inscriptions done in their name, and this was in order to kind of power up the soul in the afterlife. And this is also why, conversely, why the opposite was done, why some pharaohs would destroy engravings or, carve out pharaohs' names, previous pharaohs' names, from stuff like statues and walls, or they would desecrate the mummies, they would destroy the bodies, and this was basically a way of like getting revenge. It was a way of intending to harm that person's soul on their journey through the afterlife. The Ib, or the heart, was also seen as a physical part of the soul, and so it was often in death in these mummies, it was well preserved, it was kept inside the mummy, and it was protected often with a scarab of some kind over the top of it. The Ka, or vital essence, was what separated a living person from a dead person, and they believed that when someone died, their Ka left their body. And the Shut, or shadow, was something that every body seemed to have. You know, you could see it as your shadow is always following you, and so this was also seen as an inseparable part of the body, and therefore the soul. Which, I mean, on this last part, you know, even dogs have shadows, you know, even pens have shadows, and spoons have shadows, and tea has a shadow. So, like, does tea have a soul? You'll probably need to ask the ancient Egyptians on that one. But yeah, anyway, as I said, a very, very cool, intricate concept, I think. And since the main goal or the aim for many of these Egyptians was really like to get through the afterlife, to have a great journey and to go through onto paradise, if you understand that and you understand the various concepts they had of the soul, you can then see why they did so many of the things they did, like using the scarab to protect the heart, like preserving the bodies, like making sure the bodies weren't desecrated as well as they could. They did all of this for this single purpose of, you know, going to paradise. The Screaming Mummy is a pretty messed up entry, so you have been warned. But this was a mummy found who died around 3,500 years ago and who was stuck in this position and likely died, you know, probably in great pain, screaming. We're not exactly sure how they died, but the theory is they died in great pain, and then rigor mortis set in very quickly, and so they weren't able to move the dead body out of this frozen position. And so they just mummified her in this way, and that is how we get something like this, the Screaming Mummy. The world's first zoo was actually in, you might have guessed it, ancient Egypt. It was this zoo in Hierakonpolis around 6,000 years ago. And during excavations of the site, they found evidence of an enclosed habitat with hippos and elephants and baboons and many other animals, all seemingly kept here and buried here when they died. And this area was somewhat, you know, an upper class, rich sort of area. So it seems likely that many of these animals probably belonged as kind of pets to the rich, to the well-to-do people, so to speak. And, you know, you'd kind of expect that with importing rare animals from all over. And so when they died, again, you would expect more likely the rich people were the ones to bury them because the poor people couldn't afford burials like this, etc. But this was, technically speaking, the first zoo that we have ever found anywhere on Earth. Animal mummies. So a pretty simple one, but if you thought that only humans were mummified, you would be dead wrong. You know, get it? Dead, mummy. Anyway, Egyptians used to mummify not only humans, but also cats, bulls, goats, monkeys, crocodiles, fish, shrews, just everything apparently. Probably ants too, mummified wasps, just mummify everything, mummify the pottery, mummify the grass, mummify the air. Tier 6 female mummies more decayed than male mummies. So speaking of mummies, there is a really, I would say, messed up fact, and that's that a lot of the female mummies that we find are often more decayed than the male counterparts. And I warn you, this is a little bit twisted, but when families had a female daughter, or I guess all daughters are female, but when they had a female person in their family die, be that a daughter, a mother, you know, an auntie, a queen, a princess, whatever, when they died, the families would often keep the bodies with them just for a few days until the body started to, you know, decay a little bit, and only then would they give them into the embalmers, and they would then prepare the bodies and we would get mummies. But because they were left out for a few days for, you know, the rotting to kind of start to take effect, the preservation of a lot of these female mummies was always a bit worse than the males. Now, why did the families keep back the female bodies from the embalmers? Well, because they used to f them. Yeah. If the family gave the daughter's body, say, straight away to the embalmers, I guess they were known for committing certain acts against them, for using these attractive female bodies for their own purposes. And so to prevent that, they would keep the body, wait till the decay started to kick in, and then this would deter the embalmers, put them off actually using these bodies for their own pleasure. And I mean, that is incredibly sick and twisted. So moving on, the Zannanza Affair. So this is a very interesting event, story, tale, whatever, that happened around about 1350 BC. And this is when the Hittite king, hold on a second, Supiliuma. Okay, we're just going to call him Sup. Sup the First, who was king of this rough area here, he received a letter from an unnamed Egyptian widowed queen. And this letter read roughly as such. It read, "My husband died, a son I have not. But to thee, they say, the sons are many. If thou wouldest give me one son of thine, he would become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid." And so this was basically saying, I'm a queen of Egypt. My husband has died or was killed or whatever. Screw Egypt. You have many sons, I hear. So, let me marry one of them. I will eventually make him king or pharaoh, and he will then rule over Egypt. And so Sup, as you can imagine, was a little bit suspicious of this proposal. Naturally, he didn't know exactly who this woman was. It was a very strange request, kind of betraying Egypt in a way and going with this other nation. And it was very unusual for an Egyptian royalty to want to marry a foreigner, because naturally they wanted to keep all of the power with the Egyptians, and the Hittites were one of their main adversaries. And so with a Hittite on the Egyptian throne, you can imagine this would be a pretty great deal for the Hittites. And so Sup the First, kind of wanted to see what was going on. He would probably have been a viewer of this channel. He was quite curious. And so he sent out a messenger to Egypt to try and find what was going on. And later the messenger returns to the Hittite capital along with an envoy, or basically a messenger, of this unnamed woman. So after a bunch of arguing, back and forth, discussions, etc., Sup agrees with this envoy, with this queen, that he knows only through letter at this point. He agrees. He says he will send one of his sons named Zannanza off to Egypt to wed this queen. And then on the way to Egypt, Zannanza is killed, murdered. So as you can imagine, Sup is furious. He feels betrayed. He feels bamboozled. And he then decides, you know what, Egypt, I am going to fight back a little bit and to make you feel pain for this trickery, this attack on my son and my people. And so he orders an attack on this area here, or modern day Lebanon, but at the time it was Egyptian territory. And he attacks several Egyptian garrisons and camps there. He takes in several thousand Egyptians as prisoners. And so it's fairly even now, tit for tat. You killed my son, I killed a bunch of your people, except for the fact that many of the Egyptians he took in as prisoners actually ended up having the plague. And the plague then spread throughout the Hittites, with it actually eventually killing both Sup the First and his appointed successor, Anuwanda II. So this has always been a big question, a big mystery. Who the heck exactly was this woman? Did she ever actually even exist? Was this just a plot by the Egyptian powers to taunt Sup and to kill his son? And also, did they have his son murdered on the road? Or was this offering, did this woman actually exist? Was this proposal semi or genuinely serious? And was Zannanza's death on the road just a result of, say, random bandits? And as to that, nobody really knows. One theory I saw that really attracted me was, what if this was a war or a sabotage tactic that was far greater and more complex and underhand than anyone thinks? What if Egyptian leadership, what if they purposefully placed Egyptians who had the plague, they shipped them out to these garrisons and camps nearby the Hittites, but still in Egyptian territory, and then they faked this letter, they baited Sup into sending his son, and then they killed him on the road. And they knew this would bait Sup into a retaliatory attack, and this retaliatory it's a very hard word to say, this retaliatory attack would likely be on, areas of Egypt that were near to the Hittites. And so they knew that he would attack them and take them prisoners. And so they kind of forced his hand and tricked him into taking all of these plague-ridden Egyptians. And this obviously killed a bunch of the Hittites, leaving the Egyptians relatively stronger than ever. So it's definitely a thought. There's not too much evidence for that exact theory, but I honestly wouldn't put it past them. And as always, with, I'm going to say this with all of the fringe theories, I would love to see your thoughts on this one down below. The Cannibal Hymn. So I was truly debating moving this, further down in the iceberg, as it is honestly pretty insane. But the Cannibal Hymn is, to explain this, I need to give a little background into kind of Egyptian stuff, for lack of a better word or term. But obviously you had these pyramids, these great huge pyramids, but before that you had smaller pyramids, as well as these little tombs that we already covered called mastabas. But one of the smaller pyramids, dubbed the Pyramid of Unas, was built as the final resting place for the pharaoh Unas. And within this pyramid, they found some of the oldest pieces of complete texts in the entire world. And these were funerary texts, one of which was dubbed the Cannibal Hymn. Now, these texts basically say a bunch of things. They're blessings for Unas, they're tales of how great he is, or was as a pharaoh, as a man, as a person. They're somewhat guidance for him in the afterlife. There's various things in there. There's quite a lot in there. There's around 750 different hymns or spells. But this one, the Cannibal Hymn, tells of how Unas is basically going to devour the gods as a pharaoh and take their power and become more powerful than the gods. It has lines such as the sky is clouded, the stars are darkened, the bows move, the bones of Acre tremble. Movements cease after they have seen Unas appearing and powerful as a god who lives on his fathers, who feeds on his mothers. And indeed, Khonshu, the moon, who slaughters the lords, cuts their throats for Unas, and takes out for him what is in their bellies. He is the messenger whom he sends out to chastise. Indeed, Sheshmu was a pretty wild god. He was a god of wine, of perfume, of oil, etc. And he operated this great wine press in the underworld where he would basically use it to crush the heads of the evil people and to produce blood red wine. So, blood essentially for the dead to drink. So yeah, pretty wild. But it was he who cut up the gods for Unas and cooks for him a meal out of them in his evening cookpots. Unas is he who eats their magic, who swallows their spirits. Their great ones are for his morning meal, their middle-sized ones are for his evening meal, and their little ones are for his night meal. Their old men and the old women are for his fuel. So yeah, a very strange hymn, passage, text, whatever you want to call it, of a pharaoh literally eating the gods and gaining their powers. Dynasty 0. So this refers to the rule or the time before the unification of Egypt, or before the first dynasty, which was obviously the war between Upper and Lower Egypt, when King Nama kind of, fought a war for it and ended up uniting the two. But yeah, fairly simple. All the dynasties or the leadership roles or whatever, the structure of Egypt before this is dubbed as Dynasty 0, the Badarians. So speaking of cultures before the first dynasty, one of the earliest cultures that we have evidence for around Egypt, as if the ancient Egyptians weren't ancient enough, was the Badarian culture. And these people were in Upper Egypt around here, around 4,000 to 5,000 BC, so 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. And from what we can tell, they grew stuff, crops, lentils, root vegetables, etc. They also kept and bred livestock, so cows, sheep, goats, they hunted, they fished from the Nile, and they also performed ceremonial burial. And some of their dead were also wrapped in leather skins or animal skins, like, for example, leather, and buried with their heads looking to the west, which perhaps was a precursor to some of these Egyptian traditions. Because in ancient Egypt, or, future Egypt for the Badarians, the west was seen as the direction of the land of the dead. And so you can kind of see, when you look at this Badarian culture, you can see some of these traditions and beliefs, etc., starting to form. And these people, 1,000, 2,000 years before the first dynasty, they were thought very likely to be non-roaming people. So, they weren't nomads, they weren't travelers or foragers of that kind. They had their own land, their own area, they had wooden huts and houses, but they did do a fair amount of trade, it seems, with people from all over. Because on these sites they have found shells from the Red Sea, so along here. They found turquoise that likely came from across the Red Sea, probably in the Sinai region. Various items as well thought to have come from Syria, and possibly some trade with some people out to the southwest of them. Buff Amenhotep II. So when we found the mummy of Amenhotep II, who was a pharaoh who ruled from around 1450 BC, archaeologists noted that he was, noticeably buff. He was broad, he had a decent apparent musculature, and he seemed to be quite athletic. And all of this does line up with the fact that his father, Thutmose III, was a great military leader who expanded the size of Egypt and fought many campaigns fighting for land in both the Levant and in Nubia. So his son, Amenhotep II, was thought to have himself been a very great soldier, a great warrior, and to have been quite fit. There's rumors of him, for instance, defeating 7 different princes all at the same time in an ambush single-handedly, and he was able to apparently row harder and faster than 200 men in the Egyptian navy. He was also able to fire his bow with such power and accuracy that he was able to penetrate a thick copper plate, something that no ordinary man or archer could do. And whether these tales were true, whether they were complete truths or completely made up, or somewhere in between, like a slight embellishment sort of thing, we're not entirely sure, but he was very likely a great warrior, and he was very likely buff, athletic, and also a great pharaoh, who was also, to add on top of that, he was also the great-great-grandfather of Tutankhamun. The Gosford Glyphs were, if you can believe it, ancient Egyptian glyphs and carvings found in, drumroll, Australia. Yeah, so from here in Egypt all the way around to here in Australia, somehow maybe they went, this way, or this way, or this way, or this way, or this way. But these glyphs have been highly questioned over the years. They're honestly a little bit dubious, a little bit suspicious for various reasons. For one, the chiseling technique used isn't exactly how the ancient Egyptians used to chisel. And two, they talk about various rulers and gods, etc., using Egyptian words and symbols which wouldn't be created in Egypt for over 2,000 years. It'd be like finding a scroll apparently written by, someone like Jesus, or even someone in Jesus's time, saying like, yo, what's the drilly, cuz? I'm living in the big 2-6, no cap, skibbity, 6-7. I'm just, Mediterranean, I'm just desert maxing over here. Put an F in the chat, boys. Like, yeah, even if you found one of these and it looked like it was from around that era, the fact that they were using this sort of terminology would clearly be evidence that it wasn't. And so did these ancient Egyptians somehow make their way over to Australia? Freaking somehow, on an insane journey that wasn't documented anywhere by anyone, by any other civilization. I don't know, probably not. And it's not even as if these glyphs were like out of place artifacts. Maybe you can argue, well, they carved them in Egypt, and then through trades and through travel, etc., they made their way over to Australia, because these glyphs were carved into literal giant rocks, like rocks that are part of a mountain. So yeah, trading mountains is not exactly something the ancient people used to do. And unless you want to involve teleportation or alien abduction or something into this theory. I think it is quite kind of soundly debunked, and it was probably made by some Australians from anywhere, from the 1920s up to the 1980s. But that is just my take on it. As you know, I do deep down in my heart love all of these strange theories, these alternate histories, these alternate lost histories or timelines, which, as always, you can check out in the ultimate alt history iceberg. As always, video is linked down below. Probably have like a dozen links down there now. But yeah, those were the Gosford Glyphs. Tier 7, Lost's take on the Egyptians. So I didn't really know what to name this entry, but speaking of, alt histories and unusual theories and lost histories, etc. Lost histories. But the TV show Lost has some incredible ones regarding the Egyptians. Now, if you haven't watched Lost, or you don't care about it, or you don't want spoilers or anything like that, you can just skip to the next entry. I'm sure I'll have time-coded everything out. Because yeah, this will be a minute or two of Lost. There will, of course, be plenty of spoilers, but it is kind of a cool alternate adventure for some of the ancient Egyptians. But within Lost, basically, they're on this island, and the island itself moves around. It jumps around Earth from like spot to spot. And what happens is basically some Egyptians who are likely sailing in the Mediterranean, they end up crashing onto the island and starting an Egyptian civilization on the island. They eventually meet some of the characters from Lost, and they mistake or identify these characters or creatures or whatever. They mistake them with some of their gods, namely Osiris and Horus, due to certain powers or abilities these characters have, like for example bringing people back to life just like Horus, or for their connection to death and to the underworld like Osiris. And in this alternate, fictional, I guess, history, the Egyptians end up worshipping these people. They see them as kind of reincarnations of their gods, and they end up building various shrines and temples to them, and there are just Egyptian hieroglyphs everywhere. They built some pretty cool works of engineering, like a fail-safe sort of system for the heart of the island, which involves like diversion, waterways, a stone cork to block the light and magnetism coming from the heart of the island. And as I may have already shown, they built this huge statue of the Egyptian god Taweret, who in ancient Egypt represented childbirth and fertility, which was likely because the island always had problems with successful childbirth. And so it seems like they built this huge statue as an offering or a plea to Taweret so that she would bless the Egyptians and allow them to conceive and to actually give birth on the island. So yeah, maybe I shouldn't have included this entry in a factual iceberg. Oh well. But for me, alternate histories are incredibly interesting, and I just couldn't resist. And of course, Lost is absolutely awesome, and I don't care what anyone else says. The Green Sahara. So way back in time, since the end of the last ice age, or around 11,000 years ago, the landscape of many places around the world, and Egypt and, Northern Africa in general, were massively different. And around this time, around 10 to 11,000 years ago, the Sahara was a lot greener and not just the barren desert that it is today. And so, for example, parts of Egypt were more green, they had more plants and trees and shrubs and grasses, etc. And this was partly to the increased landfall in this whole area. And you can imagine the culture that we covered earlier, the Badarians, their ancestors might have lived even further west than they did. And then as the desert kind of expanded more and more, and as lands became drier and drier, they moved over time towards the Nile, towards, the more obvious water source. And if you go from around 12,000 years ago to the modern day, you can see a stark difference in the greenery and the rainfall. Like, it's a pretty massive difference. But even going from like the modern day to only 5,000 or 6,000 years ago during the age of the Old Kingdom, the time that the Great Pyramids were built, there was significantly more rainfall even then compared to the current day. And while the Nile obviously still exists today, many of the outlets, the heads of the Nile, so to speak, many of them have been cut off or lost or dried out, and this is due in part at least, to the reduction of rainfall and of lowering water levels. And then, of course, this ties into the ancient Sphinx theory, saying that the erosion of the Sphinx is specifically rainfall erosion, and the only way that could happen is if the Sphinx was built like 10 or 15,000 years ago, and it was rained on for thousands of years, meaning the Sphinx wasn't built by the ancient Egyptians, but by an ancient civilization before that got drowned in a massive flood, and they had invented helicopters and electricity and wireless electricity and Wi-Fi routers. And yeah, as always, I love theories like this, so let me know what you think down below. The ephemeral MK Nubian dynasty refers to an Egyptian dynasty, the 25th dynasty, in which the Nubians, or these people typically south of Egypt, actually took over and ruled Egypt in the Nubian dynasty. It lasted around 90 years or so, and it is sometimes also referred to as the Kushite Empire, or the empire or dynasty of the Black Pharaohs, as the southern Nubians were darker skinned than the more northern ethnic Egyptians. And it all started when Pi, or Pia, who was the king of Kush, which was this kingdom to the south, he ended up invading Egypt, he ended up winning, and he took over both Upper and Lower Egypt, combining them or consolidating them into the Kushite Empire. And over these 90 years, there were 5 Nubian kings who, ruled over Egypt. And because they were Nubian, they saw the Nubian capital of Napata as their spiritual homeland and not anywhere in the now invaded Egypt, which, it kind of makes sense. They weren't Egyptian, so why would they have any ties or allegiances to that particular land, the land of Egypt? But during this time, they somewhat revived the Egyptian tradition of building pyramids, as these pyramids hadn't really been built in any massive way since the Old Kingdom. This was somewhat short-lived, however, as, after these 90 years of rule, the Nubians were defeated quite heavily. They were forced back down south, and this was due to the very strong and advanced Neo-Assyrian Empire, who invaded Egypt from the north. And honestly, I think an ancient empire or ancient civilization iceberg is probably coming up pretty soon, as I've wanted to do one of these so badly, and just going through some of these ancient empires is just absolutely fascinating. But the Assyrians forced the Nubians out. They then took over control of Egypt, and they set up Egyptians to rule Egypt. And the Egyptians didn't really rule Egypt at the time. It was more like a puppet or vassal state set up by the Assyrians. And this dynasty, the 26th dynasty, this puppet state, is often deemed as the last dynasty of Egypt to be ruled by actual Egyptians, because they were kind of ruled by the Assyrians, and they would then go on to be ruled by the Persians, and then by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, which ended in Cleopatra, the last Greek ruler of Egypt, and then the Romans took over. And so really they just went from being controlled by one powerful nation to the next. So this time was is far from the golden age of Egypt, far from the times when Egypt was a great, powerful, imposing force in the area. And so yeah, the Nubian dynasty was kind of the beginning of the end for the Egyptians. The Hedgehog Goddess is a reference to an Egyptian goddess named Abaset, who was a fairly minor goddess, associated with being the protector of people, notably likely of the dead, and she, strangely enough, wears a hedgehog sitting on top of a vulture sitting on top of her head. And what's a little strange in a way is that she was only ever seen at a single site, which was a 26th dynasty tomb of a merchant in Karat Kasar Salim, and within this one tomb she is only depicted twice. So she has 2 depictions, they're both in the same tomb, and nowhere else in the entirety of Egypt, in any other tombs or crypts or depictions or anything, she's not mentioned anywhere else, which very likely means that she was a very local god, local to the immediate area, and it is thought that she was, or she had a hedgehog on her head, because sometimes they represented like safety in a way. They would burrow underground in harsh conditions, they would curl up into little spiky defensive balls when danger was nearby. So they were probably seen as quite defensive, protective animals. And also were apparently used as hats by goddesses, or used as hats by vultures, who were then used as hats by goddesses. But yeah, the more you know. Tier 8, the Slovenian Sarcophagi. And this refers to these two sarcophagi, or sarcophaguses, that were taken from Giza by a Slovenian man named Anton Lavrin. And this was all the way back in the 1800s. But he took them from Egypt to his hometown, which was Vipava, this small town in Slovenia. He put them up in the local cemetery and actually used these sarcophagi to bury essentially his parents in one and his son in the other. And before they were used by Anton, they had previously been used, they had housed a court aide and the son of a pharaoh from the 5th dynasty, or around 4,500 years ago. And obviously the bodies were removed. He put in bodies of his own family members in there, and that they are still there to this day, these ancient Egyptian sarcophagi in this small town in Slovenia, is pretty insane. Thutmose IV's heart scarab. So if you remember when we were talking about the soul and about mummification, etc., the heart was seen as a very important part of the body. And they had this kind of weird tradition where the heart would sometimes betray the soul. And so part of the reason for the scarab, that they used to put over the heart was to basically block the heart from speaking out against the soul during the soul's judgment. Almost every single one, likely all of them, were buried with a little scarab over their heart. But due to people going into the tombs and looting them, we sometimes often don't find these heart scarabs with the bodies. And Thutmose IV was one example of this, because while his body, his mummy, was found in a cache of bodies that was, put there to kind of protect the body, his heart scarab was instead found on a site in Sardinia, which means that, likely sometime throughout the years in ancient Egypt, his tomb, his body was, ransacked, looted. They took this heart scarab, and then through trade, through selling it, it went around the Mediterranean probably, and it ended up in Sardinia and then was buried there. Maybe it got lost, maybe someone died with it, something happened to it, but it was in the ground in Sardinia where we later found it. And that is all we have time for. Honestly, this has been one of my favorite icebergs. It's not as incredibly long as some of the others, but I have done, I think, a few more modern icebergs, the World Wars, for example. And so getting back to history, to archaeology, was incredibly fun. And it has reminded me that I really need to do an ancient civilization or an ancient, peoples and ancient kingdoms sort of iceberg, and so I will get onto that in due time. But I hope you have enjoyed this video so far. As always, if you do like the video, then do like the video. We are trying to hit that subscriber goal of 100,000 by the end of the year. And let me know your favorite entry on this iceberg and what sort of stuff you would like to see in the future. Just leave me a little comment in the section below. But that is about it from me. I hope you have had a lovely day and week. I hope you continue to have an amazing year. And as always, thank you for watching.